So today we're here with Richard Leonard, leader of Scottish Labour. Thanks for making it all the way down to the shipping container.
That's great, Ash. I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, I've got a really simple, easy question for the first one. I heard a rumour, and so I want to confirm it. Are you a Marxist?
No, I'm not sure I would describe myself as a Marxist. I am somebody who has read Marx. I'm somebody who I think considers myself to be on the left, I hope with a degree of intellectual underpinning, but I suspect my politics are more of a synthesis of a kind of Scottish radicalism from Keir Hardie and those pioneers through to the ILPers of the 1920s, right the way through to post-industrial utopians like Andre Gors, who are kind of, I suppose, a neo-Marxist in some way. So it's a strain of ideas that combine with my life's experiences, especially in the trade union movement, representing working people at the place of work and outside it. So as my political thinking is a synthesis of a both kind of pragmatic outlook, but also with its roots, I hope, in some kind of class analysis.
I mean, talk to me a bit about some of the texts which for you were politically transformative, because for me Marx certainly is one of those writers, really more of his journalistic work, but then it's also Frantz Fanon, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis. These were all books which my mum, when I was probably a bit too young to read, that was just like forcing into my hands. What were the texts which for you constituted your political awakening?
Well, in many ways my first political awakening took place when I went up to the local Woolworths shop and bought Tony Benn's Arguments for Socialism. And I had seen Tony Benn on Question Time, which had just emerged on the BBC at that point. And I just thought, I came from a kind of Labour supporting family, but probably more from a Harold Wilson school. And here was this guy on television talking about really quite radical ideas about not just reforming things, but quite profoundly changing them, and talking about reform of the civil service, the way the economy worked, our relationship with the European Union. And so that was a really powerful voice. And I later on met Tony in real life, which was a great honour. So that was quite informative. And I was still at school at that point. And then when I went to university, I suppose, I mean, again, I still read and still get ideas, but I go back to people like William Morris. So I just think that almost a romantic socialism is important. I think of intellectuals, as I mentioned earlier on, people like Andre Gors. I mean, Farewell to the Working Class and his critique of economic reason were really quite powerful ideas that came out of the kind of debates on the left about automation and mass unemployment in the 1980s. And of course, it was also a philosophical debate about the agency of the working class. You know, were the working class the agents for change or not? And so in some occasions I would depart company with that analysis, but I just thought it threw up some really interesting ideas, some of which I think are still relevant today, because I think the fourth industrial revolution, automation, once again opens up the possibility of a change in people's work-life balance. And it comes back to that fundamental question about who's in control of the process. And where does the power lie in those decisions about the balance of forces between capital and labour? And of course, our job in the labour movement is to try to rebalance those forces and to try to make sure that automation or changes that will happen in the way services are provided or industry works or the economy is run are there to benefit, to capture a phrase, the many and not the few.
I mean, one of the things which you lived through was the way in which Margaret Thatcher set fire to the system that had come before and instituted a new economic order. And I think in a funny way, non-reformist reform is a phrase that the left bandies around a lot, but it's the right who've done it better than anyone else. I would say right to buy was one of those non-reformist reforms. Do you have an idea in your head when you're launching policies like free bus travel in Scotland, that's the soft edge of something much bigger and much more radical, which changes the way in which people relate to the economy, to services and to work itself?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher. I mean, I've got a kind of personal testimony about Margaret Thatcher, because when I first went to Scotland in 1980, My family was, my parents and my sisters were still living in Yorkshire, and the factory where my dad worked was closed down. It was a clothing factory, closed down because of Thatcherism and deindustrialisation and the whole kind of approach to the value of the pound, the relationship between the manufacturing base and the service economy that was embodied in both Thatcher and people like Geoffrey Howe, who was a chancellor. So that I bear that scar to some extent, but also it is a reminder to me that there was a shift, and so we've been, and that really kind of heralded. Although I suppose you could go back to the mid-70s and the IMF and the crisis in '76, but it largely heralded the arrival in British politics and economics of neoliberalism. And that whole agenda of privatisation, that whole agenda of rolling back the state, that whole agenda of outsourcing, which I think carried on and has carried on for quite a long time. But I think people understand that just doesn't work, and they're looking for an alternative to it. And I think the challenge for those of us on the left is how can we formulate a credible left socialist alternative to that, rather than people seeking refuge in a right-wing xenophobic narrative.
But I mean, there is a leftism which has its home in nostalgia, and you see quite a few, this tendency on the left where they look at the 1970s and go, you know what, that's great, corduroys, that's me, big bureaucratic state-run services, that's what I want. And then there's an untested left, which is trying to explore ideas like universal basic income, universal basic services, of which free transport would be a part, looking at things like a 4-day week as a response to automation. And these are trying to implement policies which have never been tried in this country. Do you see yourself as being part of that tendency and having some of those policy goals? I think that there is, that you're right to say that there are things that we haven't really tried. We haven't really tried public services that are properly run according to the interests and the governance of both the people using the services and the people delivering the services. I think there are lots of interesting experiments that we could roll out. And as I say, I think cooperative ownership is one which I'm particularly keen to see develop, because it's a tradition which can be traced back in the UK and in Scotland. But it's really flourished on the continent in northern Italy and in Mondragon in Spain and these kind of places. So I think that the goal that we should have as a movement is to see what we can do to try to promote and encourage the confidence that people need to have to take forward those cooperative ideas as well. Because I think there are lots of people that hear about the municipal socialist agenda and they are questioning what's the difference between that and the Conservatives' localism agenda. Don't both those things weaken the ability of central government to shape policy and fund policy?
Well, it depends whether you take a centralised or a decentralised view of decision making. And when, in the Labour Party we talk about a redistribution of wealth and power, it's the redistribution of power which is perhaps the most important of those two. And a redistribution of power, in my eyes, is looking at what level in the state are those powers exercised. And so we have a debate about what powers the Scottish Parliament should have, for example, compared to Westminster. What powers should there be at a local authority level in Scotland compared to the Scottish Parliament? Because over the last few years of an SNP administration in Scotland, there's been a really strong centralising tendency. And so, I've been clear that I support strong local government, and I support a freedom for locally elected representatives to decide on their budget levels, to be able to set a local council tax, to be able to have much more control over their financial welfare. And unless that can be achieved, then we continue to see a kind of hollowed out localism rather than a properly powerful municipal arm of government which is accountable to people and is local to people.
Next question on something completely different. Drugs.
Yep.
Do you have any?
No.
Well, there's been a lot in the news recently about Michael Gove doing cocaine, Rory Stewart smoking opium. I think Kit Malthouse confessed to doing ketamine at Burgoyne or something or other. And one of the things that's been lost in all of this has been the legacy of the war on drugs in this country and abroad, and also I think a critical assessment on whether or not a prohibitionist approach to drugs has been working. So Scotland has got one of the worst rates for drug deaths in Europe, and I think it's twice as frequent in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK. So there's people are suffering from problems with addiction. Do you see the decriminalisation of drugs, for instance, as they have in Portugal, as part of a solution to the absolute pandemic of drug deaths or HIV infections from intravenous drug use?
Well, we are having a debate about that, including inside the Labour Party in Scotland. I think that there is an understanding that things can't go on as they are, that the various drug strategies have simply not worked. And because you're right, we've got the highest rate of drugs deaths of despair in the whole of not just the UK, but the whole of Europe. And so there is a profound challenge which faces us, which we need to find some answers to. And so we've debated in the Scottish Parliament, for example, the idea of having safe spaces for people, drugs rooms and so on. And there is resistance to that from the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament, and there is resistance to that from those people who believe this is a matter of law and order, rather than, as I think it should be treated, a matter of public health. And so I just think we need to examine international experience. The Portuguese experience is one that's been referred to by a number of people as being worth us having a look at, and I think that we should. There is a wider issue here, which is that there are 900,000 people in Scotland alone, which is over 20% of the entire adult population, who are on antidepressants. So there is that area of illegal drugs, but there is also that question about the extent to which our society is functioning in such a way that nearly a quarter of the adult population are being prescribed with antidepressants. That raises profound questions for us as socialists. What kind of society is it that drives people into that down that path?
I mean, you look at the opioid crisis in the United States, and in particular the way in which it's affected people in the Rust Belt. And sometimes you think capitalism writes its own poetry, which is you take away quality employment, you take away factories, you take away heavy industry, and then you have the overprescription of opioids to, numb the pain, and then that pushes people into fentanyl use or heroin use. So I do take your point about the connection of drug use to other forms of suffering. But just to push on this a bit more, because, yes, this issue of safe usage rooms is being explored in the Scottish Parliament, and I really commend it for being explored. But this was an idea that David Cameron came out with years ago. This wasn't a particularly radical or necessarily progressive idea. So I put it to you that Labour is still quite wedded to small c social conservatism when it comes to matters of drug policy, and takes a disciplinarian approach to shaping drugs policy because it's scared of alienating people and looking soft on crime.
Well, I think, to be fair, there needs to be a proper public debate about it. I think the reason why there may be reluctance by people like me to say I'm in favour of absolute decriminalisation is because there needs to, if there's going to be that kind of revolution, I think it needs to be a revolution by consent. I think there needs to be a public debate in which we explore the implications of such a move. In that debate, draw on international experience and where it has led to a significant reduction in the number of people who die as a result of a drug addiction. Then that would be something which would strongly commend itself. Again, if you go back to the Labour Party's roots are with people like Keir Hardie and the temperance movement. So there's always been that debate inside our own movement and our own party about our relationship with addictive substances and how we go about that. And of course, maybe you are reflecting on a kind of Keir Hardie strain which still runs with us, which is one of prohibitionism and abstinence and temperance. My point is, this is a crisis point. And when Michael Gove gave that interview and revealed his cocaine use,
I mean, he was a journalist in the 90s. I'd be more surprised if he didn't take it.
I couldn't possibly comment, Ash. But when he commented on that, we then got a surfeit of journalists phoning us up and sending us emails demanding to know what our record and history was in drug use. Did you take drugs? When did you take them? What form was it? Who was it? So the media tends to focus on things like that and ignores the fact that we've got the record number in the whole of Europe of people who are dying as a result of drug addiction. So I think there's got to be a wake-up call across society, including the media, and I think there's got to be a big debate about where we have reached and what kind of radical solutions there might be. And in considering that, I think we need to have a fairly tolerant and broad canvas of options to look at to determine what the best way forward is.
I want to talk a little bit about green issues because obviously Labour have been behind this push to declare a climate emergency. There's been a lot being said about a green industrial revolution and using climate change not just as a crisis that must be met, but an opportunity to bring back sustainable and quality forms of employment to regions of the country which have been left behind. For me, the interesting thing, particularly in Scotland, has been this battle over North Sea oil and the role of North Sea oil in the economy, and to what extent should North Sea oil enjoy tax cuts or subsidies. What's your view on some of these debates around North Sea oil and how that fits in with Labour's ambitions to decarbonise the economy by 2030 or 2050, whatever it is that conference decides later this summer?
So there are two what were oil rig fabrication yards on the coast of Fife, which have moved on from oil rig fabrication, and they now make jackets for offshore wind installations. There is a massive contract which has been won by the French state company EDF to build a huge wind farm 10 miles off the coast of Fife, so 10 miles away from where these fabrication yards are situated. And we understand that the order for that work has been placed through an Italian company with a yard in Indonesia. So I think there is some concern that the just transition we want to see in theory isn't necessarily happening in practice, and I think what that opens up is a debate about how much more we need to get away from a market-based approach and how much more we need to get onto a planned approach to economic decision making, a planned approach to that transition that we absolutely need to make from a toxic economy to a sustainable society. And so there needs to be worker involvement in that. One of the concerns that we've had inside the Labour Party is that there is insufficient attention paid to the voice of workers. And so, for example, I don't think the overnight closure of the oil and gas industry in the UK continental shelf is the right prescription. I think what we need to do is understand how we can get to where we need to be in 2025 and 2030 and 2035, how we can make the change from an oil-based economy, which in Scotland is still, one of the leviathans of the whole Scottish economy, how we can get away from that and start to reinvest in these alternative forms of energy. But I think by most people's reckoning, there will continue to be oil and gas consumption for the next decade, possibly for the next 2 decades. And there then becomes a debate about, well, so do you close down the production here and then import it? Or do you look at a fair transition from production here to alternative fuel sources?
But if you accept that there needs to be a transition away from fossil fuels within the next decade, if we're going to arrest climate change at a 1.5 degrees change in global temperatures, one of the commitments would be no new carbon infrastructure. And that's something which would be very difficult to square with some of the very real and legitimate concerns, in particular from the unions who are part of the Labour movement. So how do you envision having that conversation and sometimes conflict in such a way that the planet wins out?
Yeah, and it's difficult. I suppose, again, drawing on my own lifetime experience, Ash, I go back to what happened to the coal industry in this country. The coal industry in this country was decimated by a kind of brutal governmental decision just to close it down. And it was supposed to be about what's economic, what's not economic. The test could have been applied about its environmental sustainability or whatever. But that tells me that there are ways of making a transition in the economy away from a carbon-based fuel source. But there's got to be a better way of doing it than just closing down employment, abandoning communities, and leaving people to the forces of the market. There's got to be a planned approach. And that's why, whether we were facing a climate crisis or not, I would still be advocating the need for government to be working with unions and to be working with businesses to try to work out where we want to be in 5 years' time and 10 years' time as an economy, and planning around that and doing it in such a way that there is leadership given by government, and I want that leadership to be given by a Scottish Labour government in Scotland and by Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell government at a UK level.
I mean, one area where you have been taking real leadership has been wealth taxes. And I was hoping that you could explain something to me, because every time I go on establishment media and I talk about wealth taxes, whatever right-wing ghoul they've got me up against always says the same thing, which is the minute you try and implement a wealth tax, the rich will simply move their money elsewhere. It can be done overnight, no problem, and what you end up with is less tax intake overall than had you never tried to implement it in the first place. What would the perfect rebuttal look like to that?
Well, one of the big recipients of wealth is the wealth that's taken by people through land ownership. And in Scotland, 342, or is it 432? I can never get the right word. I think 432 people own 50% of all the land of Scotland. So there is a huge concentration of wealth. There's never been any kind of revolution over land ownership in Scotland. And so there are big areas of wealth which are eminently taxable, I have to say, and not really movable. And it seems to me to be almost a moral challenge that we can sit back. We understand on the left especially that at the moment we're seeing a rise in poverty, but also an increasing widening of inequality. And widening of inequality of income is bad, but the widening of inequality of wealth is even greater and is even, in my eyes, worse and needs to be addressed. And at a time of austerity, when everyone's been told that there aren't resources to spend on public services or to invest in the economy or to bring about the green industrial revolution, we've got this massive amount of wealth in the country which is untapped or is concentrated in a few hands, or is exported abroad, or is sitting in a foreign bank, or is in some kind of tax haven. I mean, if you take Scotland alone, the richest 1% of people own more personal wealth than the whole of the poorest 50% put together. I mean, that's a staggering figure, and just tells me that that's why it's absolutely the right time to start talking about how we tax wealth.
So the way you're talking about a wealth tax in relation to land, it sounds that you don't anticipate there being a great deal of conflict when it comes to trying to implement it. Whereas I've talked to some people on the left, and maybe, they've just watched a very British coup one too many times, but they anticipate the first Corbyn government having to be run under siege. Do you not have that in the back of your head, which is it's not going to be done easily?
It won't be done easily. I mean, there are vested interests. The people that own the land in Scotland are not all, because there is a kind of nouveau riche element, but a lot of them are old aristocrats that have owned that land for generations and generations. So I don't expect there to be a rapid bowing down to an incoming Scottish Labour government and a surrendering of a fair share of taxation through a wealth tax or whatever. But I think there's got to be popular support for those measures, and any polling or any campaigning that we've done says that the introduction at this time of a wealth tax would be an extremely popular thing to do. And I think it's about building a coalition of support so that it becomes almost the settled will of people that this is what we should do, that we need to try and look at how we can address that inequality. And as I said to you earlier on, I think the issue for me is never solely about inequalities of wealth or income. It's about the inequalities of power that often accompany that. And so it's how we address that. How do we get a fairer distribution of power in society? And a wealth tax is one way of doing it. But I think avoiding seeing those huge inequalities of wealth opening up in the first place is a part of what we need to do as well.
I mean, so let's talk about distribution of power, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to do it. Let's talk about the State of the Union, because with Boris Johnson sliding and oozing his way ever closer to number 10, there are figures in the SNP saying, bring it on. This is going to mean Indie Ref 2.0, and ultimately this time we're just about going to, get yes over the line. Do you foresee there being a revival of the independence issue after Boris Johnson premiership, number one? And number two, do you think there needs to be a new constitutional offer from Labour in order to hold on to Scotland?
Yeah, that's a long and multifaceted question, isn't it? I mean, first of all, Boris Johnson and what he typifies seems to represent an abandonment of conservatism and unionism, and so I think it's almost manifesting itself in a form of English nationalism. He said before he doesn't think a Scottish MP should ever be Prime Minister, for example, in the devolution era. So I think that he poses a big threat to the union and the shared endeavour which we are on this shared island. I think
his party membership back him in that polling from YouGov, which was released just a few days ago. It showed that in order to get Brexit over the line, the majority of Conservative Party members are happy to see a reunified Ireland, are happy to see an independent Scotland. The only thing they don't want is Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister.
Yes, and I think that in that way we can see that Boris Johnson's conservatism, Boris Johnson's nationalism, does represent a real threat to the continuation of the union that we enjoy. So I think that's one issue. The other issue, of course, which the Scottish nationalists face is the unpicking of our relationship with the European Union through the Brexit process, which is 40 odd years old, has proved to be extremely difficult and may well yet prove to be extremely economically damaging, especially if it's a no-deal Brexit. And then when people compare that to the 300-year-old economic and political union which there's been between Scotland and the rest of the UK, then you can see that there are real concerns about what that would mean. And in fact, the SNP has been talking in its conference and over the course of the last year or so about their prospectus for a second independence referendum, where they are saying they want to ditch the pound, so there will be a separate Scottish currency, and in order to achieve that, and in order to allow for some kind of fiscal prudence to prevail, and for the right reserves to be in the Scottish central bank to pay to underwrite currencies and to underwrite the banking sector, there would need to be huge economic shock measures, massive fiscal retraction to pay for that, to get to a point where Scotland could stand alone and back up its own currency. And so the message for the people of Scotland is what the SNP are standing for is a form of austerity which is significantly worse than the form of austerity that's been practiced by Philip Hammond and George Osborne before him.
But I mean, I can get my head around the idea of wanting to secede if Boris Johnson's going to be in charge of you, because I look at that prospect and I want to gnaw off my own arm. And so when it comes to a Labour response, which is as much about political values, political culture, as it is about economic institutional arrangements, how do you see that Labour offer working alongside a revived Scottish nationalism?
Well, I think we've got to talk about a more kind of federal form of the UK, and I think we need to be prepared to say that the UK state is still too centralised a state, and that's not just the view from Glasgow, from Edinburgh, from Inverness, from Shetland. It's the view from Manchester and Leeds, and it's the view from Birmingham. So, I think that we are tapping into an understanding which is clear to many people that the UK state needs to be reformed. And so there has been talk of a constitutional convention convened by the Labour Party. There's been talk about a constitutional convention after the election of a Labour government. I would prefer to see a constitutional convention before the election of a Labour government, because that was the model that we had in Scotland in the 1990s, so that by the time we got to the election of Labour in 1997, we had a clear blueprint for what a Scottish Parliament would look like, what powers it would have, which powers would be retained at Westminster. And I just think some of that work now would be really, really useful in informing a reforming, constitutionally modernising Jeremy Corbyn government going into power sooner, hopefully, rather than later. So I think we need to be clear that we are not a party that stands for the status quo, economically, politically, or constitutionally. We want to see reform. So we want to see abolition of the House of Lords, but we want to see stronger regional and national government within the UK as well. And I think if we do that, then I think that will appeal to people who want to see more devolution, who want to see more decisions being made in Scotland, but don't want to walk away from what has been a fairly successful economic, political and social union that's lasted for 300 years. And for us on the left, what's really important is, and this was an argument I had in the last referendum, and if there's another one that comes along in the next few years, which I hope that there isn't,
we might have a few referenda coming up in the next few years.
We'd need to have it again. But the point is that you can have it's perfectly possible to have political independence in Scotland. But political independence without any economic independence, when your economy is so integrated into the rest of the UK economy, I think is a backward step. And for us on the left, would take us further away from being able to put under any kind of democratic control the economy of this country in order that it better serves the interests of working people instead of those who own the wealth in the country.
I'll never forget, when I was at sixth form, I did a politics A-level and asked my politics teacher, I was like, sir, why do we have a codified constitution? Even the Americans have one. And he was like, Miss Sarkar, I can assure you all the major constitutional questions have been settled in this country. Nothing terribly exciting is going to happen for the next 200 years. And then lo and behold was Indy Ref 1, followed by Brexit referendum. And every so often I just think about, like, should I write him a letter being like, I told you so? I've got one last question for you. And it's something which I really like asking MPs. And that's, if you could get one policy on the next manifesto, and it's not already Labour Party policy, what would it be?
Oh, well, it takes us right back to our earlier conversation about working time. I mean, I don't think we have said as a party, but I think that we need, as a first step, to say we will end the UK opt-out of the Working Time Directive, whether we're in the EU or outside the EU. I mean, if you look at the people who, in Scotland alone, 250,000 working people opt out or are opted out of their right to a 48-hour week, and the industries where that's most prevalent are agriculture and construction. And the industries with the worst accident rates are agriculture and construction. So it's a health and safety measure. But I also think, as a labour movement, if you look at the foundation of the trade unions, the general unions of the 1880s, if you look at the foundations of the Labour Party, it was about shorter hours and longer life. So I think as a Labour Party, we need to recapture that idea that we are on the side of people. And if we're going to drive up things like productivity, we need to start to make the case again for the managed reduction of working time. And if that's a 4-day week or a 3-day week, productivity in the 3-day week was higher than it was in the 5-day week. So I think that we need to get back into that territory of arguing for what people you really value in life. And I'll finish with this small, again, instructive tale. About a year ago, I went to one of the shipyards on the River Clyde. And I went in on a Monday morning, and it was very tight. The workshop was very tidy, and people were working hard, and the machinery was going full pelt. And I said to one of the shop stewards, "Tell me, why is the workshop so clean? You know, last time I was in here, there were tools lying around. It was dirty, and so on." And he said, "Oh, it's because it's part of the bonus system." I said, "All right, yes. If we get absenteeism down, and we hit our performance targets, and we have a clean workshop, we get a bonus." And so I said, "So that's extra money in your salary at the end of the month, or extra money in your fortnightly pay?" He said, No. We get, instead of working a half day on Friday, we get the whole of the Friday off. So the unit of currency of bargaining in that shipyard in Glasgow is time. And so they are well-paid workers, and so for them, money is not such a big issue as it would be for lower-paid workers. But I do think it's interesting that the price for them is not extra money in their pay packets. The price for them is a 3-day weekend.
Well, there you are. You are a Marxist at heart.
If you tell me, Ash, I'm a Marxist,
I
maybe
think
I am.
you are. If you're thinking about time being a form of remuneration for labour, then yeah, you're a Marxist, fam. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.